What is up, everyone? Today we are back with episode 3 of Wolfpack.
Sit back, relax, and make sure to subscribe to see more of our recaps.
And episode 3 starts with Tia, Cyrus, Phoebe, and Austin going to an abandoned building to check out the fire. From the top of the building, they could see the fire raging through California. And they start to have a conversation about how the police think that it's one of them that started the fire. Phoebe, who is the popular kind of slutty girl, talks about how she thinks it's actually Blake who started the fire because Blake hasn't been the same ever since the accident, and she doesn't have social media, she doesn't have a phone, and she pretty much blocked everybody out of her life, including Phoebe, whom she used to be close with. As the teens were on top of the building and Phoebe was trying to take a selfie, we witness a giant werewolf crawling up the building just underneath the floor that they were at. But before the werewolf could kill one of them or do anything, the cops show up because Tia turned on the location on her phone because her parents freak out every time she turns it off. And the cops track them there because they wanted to question them about the fire, because the police at this point think that one of them or one of them from that school bus started the fire that destroyed a lot of homes. And to continue with the scene we left off on episode 2, Everett, Blake, and the twins were riding in a car to the police station with Ramsey. Everett, because he has problems with anxiety, starts to get panic attacks in the car, but Blake manages to calm him down till they get to the police station. When they pulled over and were going inside the station, they noticed so many people who were displaced because of the fire, and the many families that lost their homes were now being housed in a large police facility. As the guys were waiting in the interrogation room to be interrogated, Blake notices Phoebe leaving one of the interrogation rooms, and she asks her what's going on, and Phoebe tells her that she told the cops that Blake started the fire. At least, Phoebe thinks that. And Phoebe's like really overtly rude towards Blake because she just hates her guts. As Phoebe and her friends get released after being interrogated, Blake, Everett, and the twins try to come up with some kind of story that matches because they were in the woods. And Harlan comes up with this great idea to tell the police that they were in the woods because they were hiding from people to smoke some weed. And this is pretty ingenious because everybody expects teenagers to act a fool, and if they did say this, it would be more believable than saying, hey, we were doing a school project in the woods, which Luna here suggested. I mean, I'd never believe that. Inside the interrogation room, Everett was the first one to be interrogated by Ramsey. As she kept asking him questions and kept pushing a little, Everett got a little anxious and he kind of ruined the story and said that he was smoking an edible. And if you guys don't know, you don't smoke an edible, you just eat it. And Harlan, because of his super hearing, was actually hearing him from the other room, and he was getting really pissed off because Everett ruined their alibi. And as Harlan was mumbling to himself saying, Everett, just say you took the edible and we smoked, Jesus, all of a sudden, Everett could just hear Harlan from the other room. And as Harlan was losing faith in Everett and thinking that they were going to be arrested because their stories don't match, Everett says what Harlan was mumbling to himself verbatim. And Harlan realizes that Everett can actually hear him. And to top things off, not only is Everett the one that can hear Harlan, all of them can hear each other from separate rooms. Ramsey had a lot of questions, and her and Everett start talking about Connor. Everett talks about how Connor is still missing and how they need to find him before something bad happens to him. And as Harlan was trying to talk him through the interrogation from the other room, Officer Miller gets inside the room and he gets incredibly aggressive with Harlan. But before he could hurt him, Garrett, Harlan's dad, gets there and he pretty much saw everything, and he decides to take his underage kids back home since the police can't hold them there unless they charge them with a crime. And as Garrett and the twins walk out of the station, Luna tells her father that he also has to take Blake and Everett with him because they are like them. And since both Everett and Blake were minors and they said that they did not volunteer to be interrogated, Ramsey had no choice but to let them go. And as Blake, Harlan, and the twins were facing their own problems with the police, Phoebe was having her own issues with her tires. As she was getting inside her car and talking to her father, she notices that one of her tires were slashed, and it was almost like somebody used a large knife to slash them. And one by one, we see the giant werewolf that we saw earlier as they were in that abandoned abandoned building, slash all of her tires. But nothing happens to Phoebe and her car, and she ends up driving 2 or 3 miles on the rims alone just to get away from that area. Oh yeah, she also ends up blaming Blake for the tires because she just hates her and she thinks she's the cause of all of her problems. And at Garrett's place, we see that it's actually difficult for everyone here to accept the werewolf scenario. We notice that Harlan is just trying to get rid of Blake and Everett from his life and just continue with living how he was living. But Luna doesn't really like that idea. She wants them to stay together, and she genuinely thinks that they're now some kind of pack, like a wolf pack, pretty much. Their father talks about how he doesn't know what's gonna happen to Everett and Blake because they are actually bitten by a werewolf. They weren't born as werewolf cubs, and they could potentially grow fangs, turn into a werewolf, and start killing people. And as the twins and their father were having their own private conversation, it was still the full moon, and Everett and Blake were experiencing what it feels like to be a werewolf for the first time. And out of the many symptoms and feelings that they experienced, there were reoccurring hallucinations, and this time, Blake was experiencing a hallucination that involved Everett in a very intimate way. After her very steamy hallucination, Blake tells Everett that the man that called him called her too. But she is actually worried that the call might not be for her, it could potentially be for her family. And she worries about this because what he said to her wasn't really specific. The man on the phone just said, "You're not safe here." And she potentially thinks that the message was supposed to be for her family, and the man thinks that they're not safe with her because she is now a werewolf. And as Blake and Everett were contemplating the potential idea that they both can be really dangerous now, Garrett and the twins arrive, and Garrett was heading to Phoebe to check if she was okay because she called Harlan on her phone and complained about how Blake slashed her tires. If you guys are wondering why she didn't call Blake herself, that's because Blake doesn't have a phone. Yeah, she lives off the grid. And as Garrett left to check on Phoebe, we noticed that there was a cop car parked a few blocks away from Garrett's house. And as the guys were inside the house having a conversation about how bizarre it was that they were able to hear each other back at the police station, Luna notices a smell, and she recognizes the smell, and it kind of smells like acid. And just when she smelled it, the rest of the guys smell it too. And she tells them that she knows this smell, and it's actually the smell of anger. As soon as she said that, they hear a very heavy knock on their door, and it was apparently Officer Miller. Harlan tells him that he can't come inside, but Officer Miller tells him that he doesn't have to come inside, he could just come out and they can have a conversation. But as soon as Harlan goes outside, Officer Miller physically restrains Harlan and slams his head against the wall. And as Miller was brutally interrogating Harlan about who started the fire, Luna calls their dad and she tells him what's going on outside their house. And as soon as Garrett hears this, he turns his car back around and he tells her that he's coming. Meanwhile, outside, as we were seeing a really brutal act of police brutality, we see that the giant werewolf has apparently made its way to Garrett's house. And as Officer Miller was trying to beat out a confession out of Harlan, Harlan starts to hear somebody running toward them. And in an instant, as soon as Harlan noticed it was the werewolf was already mid-air lunging at Officer Miller, and it takes him away and drags him inside the forest. Feeling incredibly shocked because he's never actually seen a werewolf before, Harlan gets inside the house and he's really tongue-tied. And he takes the phone from his sister and he starts talking to his dad about what he saw. And as soon as Harlan tells Garrett about the werewolf, Garrett tells him to go to the stables and get a gun. And as Harlan and his sister sneak around to get the weapon, Blake and Everett were about to leave the house. But just before they walked out, Everett gets a call, and it's that same mysterious voice again. And the voice tells them not to leave the house because they're almost safe. And as Blake and Everett were wondering about what to do, Officer Miller was having a little dilemma of his own. He wakes up in the middle of the woods feeling really disoriented, his gun was not inside his holster, and he sees a giant werewolf that lunges at him and smashes his head to bits after breaking his hand. I don't know about you guys, but that seems like justice well served to me. As we go back to the twins Harlan and Luna, they get to the stables, they find the gun, and they also find out that it's loaded with a silver bullet. But before they make it back inside the house, Blake was not convinced by the voice on Everett's phone, and she decides to take matters into her own hand and just leave the house. And as Everett was trying to follow her from behind and convince her to stay inside the house, they hear some kind of sound, and when they turn around, it was apparently the werewolf, and it slowly walks toward them. As it was getting too close to Everett, Harlan and Luna get there, and Harlan shoots the gun and scares off the werewolf. And the third episode ends with Garrett getting home and Harlan and Luna facing their father about the gun and the silver bullet he was keeping at the stables. We also walk away with the realization that now Everett, Luna, Harlan, and Blake are part of this giant werewolf's pack. And that's why the werewolf didn't attack Everett when it could before Harlan got there with the gun. Episode 4 opens with a scene where Austin and his mom go to see Ramsey about what Austin saw in the woods. Apparently, Austin has been having a really difficult time sleeping or doing anything because of what he experienced. And he tries to tell Ramsey about what happened, but she tells him that he just had a traumatic experience and it's not some giant 7-foot-tall monster. And this really upsets him because she's questioning what he saw, and he barges out of the station with his mom. Meanwhile, back at Garrett's house, he has a very adult conversation with his kids. He tells them that he didn't know who they were and he found them as cubs and they just somehow turned back to humans. And he didn't know what was gonna happen next, so he wanted to prepare himself, and that's why he made the silver bullets. And he doesn't even know if silver bullets kill werewolves, but he has a feeling that they're about to find out soon because they all believe that the werewolf that's been chasing them around is actually Harlan and Luna's father. Their biological father. And after they talk about what they're gonna do next, Garrett drives Everett and Blake to their respective homes. He tells the both of them to go to school tomorrow because all the schools are now reopened and to just act normal. And he tells them to do this because at this point, the police, the fire department, everybody thinks that the fire was caused by somebody from the school. And if they're acting suspicious in any way, the police and everybody else is gonna think they caused the fire. And everybody was dealing with this bizarre werewolf scenario their own way. Harlan becomes more rebellious, starts going out, going to clubs because he just doesn't want to think about it. His sister becomes a little more meticulous because she doesn't want anybody to get hurt. And Blake and Everett just try to forget about what's going on, but it's kind of hard because they're now werewolves. And this is especially hard for Everett, who can now listen to pretty much everything around him, and he overhears his parents talking badly about him, and that really sets him off. And as Everett gets to class, Austin walks up to him and starts talking to him about his problems with anxiety. Apparently, Austin can no longer sleep or think or do anything because of what he saw in the woods, and he wants Everett to give him some kind of pill so he could just go to bed. And Everett agrees to give him a pill, but in exchange, Austin has to do something for Everett. As everybody was trying to keep low-key and just seem normal, some kind of substitute teacher walks into Everett's classroom and tells them that they have a test due. Trying to do the test and remember what he studied before the fire started and all of this werewolf madness occurred, Everett gets the anxiety attacks again. And this time, he's not the only one feeling the anxiety. Apparently, everybody coming together has somehow sparked something in the group, and Luna and Harlan and Blake also start to feel Everett's anxiety. They find him in the bathroom, and Harlan gets a little pissed off because he doesn't want to feel somebody else's stress, and he tells Everett to calm down. And Everett just kept saying werewolf over and over again, and he really pisses off Harlan to a point where Harlan almost attacks him, but he instantly notices that he grew fangs out of nowhere when he got really pissed off at Everett. And from this incident, they all somehow now think that them being together exacerbates their werewolf side, making them more violent to a point where they might end up hurting other people. And since none of them wanted to turn into rabid animals, at this point, they all decide that it's better if they just stay away from one another. Garrett, who knows that Ramsey's investigating this fire and what caused it, goes to give her his professional opinion as a park ranger. When she shows him the carcass of a ram that she found while she was investigating, he looks at the wounds on the ram and tells her that it's probably a black bear. Meanwhile, as Luna was in the library, thinking about the recent flashbacks she's been having about a horse that she owned when she was a kid, Austin approaches her and asks her to draw something for him. Oh yeah, he also figures out that she has this big crush on him. And as Luna was spending time with her crush, drawing what he saw in the woods, Blake was finding it quite difficult living in a motel with her overworked dad and her challenged brother. As she was about to go to work as a parking attendant, her father tells her to call in sick because he has to go do something because he wants to get out of this motel, and she has to stay behind and watch Danny, her little brother. But just before he left, he gives her this burner phone and tells her not to pick up the phone in the motel. When she asks him why, he tells her that some pervy guy keeps calling, and when she asks him what he was saying, he tells her that he didn't talk to him but her little brother. And when she asks her brother about what he heard on the phone, he writes it for her on his little iPad thingy. And what he wrote reads, "You won't survive without them." And as soon as Blake read that, the burner phone that her father just gave her starts to ring. And she panics, knowing that it's the same guy that's been calling Everett and the rest of the guys. And because of this, she decides to take her brother Danny to work with her. Meanwhile, Harlan was kind of getting it on with Cyrus, whose dad used to be a fireman that died in a fire. They have a conversation, and after a little puff pass, they end up making out. Back at the parking garage, Blake hears something coming from upstairs. So she tells her little brother to stay at her post and that she's gonna be back in 5 minutes, and she goes up to check it out. But when she gets there, it was just Phoebe and Tia who were really stoned out of their minds. And in those 5 minutes that she was absent, the werewolf got to the parking garage and took her brother Danny. And when she got back to her post, Danny was nowhere to be found. Blake, of course, starts to panic and starts looking for her brother, and Everett, who was at home just trying to relax, starts to notice his TV, and he sees that his TV is broadcasting the security camera footage from where Blake works. And when he turns around in his living room, he sees Blake's parking post, almost as if somebody was sending him signals, visions that Blake was in distress. Feeling incredibly frustrated, she goes to the top of the parking garage and screams Danny's name. But as the audience, we hear her saying his name, and at the same time, we can hear her almost howling. As she got back down to her parking post and was making a phone call to her father, she notices somebody approaching her. And when she gets closer to look, apparently it was Everett, and he was holding Danny in his hands. Danny wasn't really hurt in any way, but they noticed that he was clenching on to something in his hand. And when he opens his hand, Blake and Everett notice that it's a piece of fur from the werewolf that took him. And episode 4 concludes with Harlan, Luna, Blake, and Everett all coming to the parking garage because they heard Blake howling. And this signals the fact that now these group of teenagers are a wolf pack. I hope you guys enjoyed our recaps. Make sure to leave a like, leave a comment, and most of all, subscribe to our channel. And I'll see you guys on the next recap. Love you all. Bye.